50. I recognize Mr. Nadler to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would add the Families Flying Together Act to the bill, an act which Mr. Davis and I introduced together last year. I first introduced this bill several years ago after hearing from people who were seated separately from their toddlers on their cross-country flight. As airlines change policies and increase fees for a variety of basic services, it is becoming more difficult for families to sit together on commercial flights. From airlines charging a fee to make advanced seat assignments, to charging a premium for window or aisle seats, to eliminating advanced boarding for parents with small children, the obstacles for families are growing. When parents are given a seat assignment apart from their young children, the only recourse is to rely on another passenger to willingly change seats. This is an inconvenience for everyone involved, and it is complicated by the fact that a passenger might have to vacate a seat for which he or she had paid a premium in order to allow a parent to sit next to their child. That is not safe, and it is not fair to the families or to the other passengers. The Families Flying Together Act and this amendment simply requires the airlines to establish a policy to ensure that families traveling with young children are seated together to the greatest extent practicable, and to make the policy clearly available to the public on the carrier's website. It does not require that every family always sit together. I wish we could do that. But it does require that the airlines establish a policy as to how to do this to the maximum extent practicable. Some people might think the Families Flying Together Act is already included in this bill. One provision of the bill, which requires the airlines to notify passengers if seats are not available together at the point of purchase, is included in the base bill. I thank the chairman for support of that aspect of the bill, but that provision only addresses this problem at the time of initial booking. Unfortunately, the problem arises at other times and in other ways. What happens if the airline does not allow you to select seats when purchasing tickets? What if there are flight cancellations or delays and missed connections? Some things are outside of the airline's control, but there has to be a better solution than no solution at all. My amendment simply requires the airlines to pay some attention to this issue, to have a policy, a stated policy of how to deal with this problem where possible, and to be more transparent with the flying public about how it will handle these situations. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to add the rest of the Families Flying Together Act to the underlying bill and put an end to the absurdity, or actually not put an end, but to reduce the extent of the absurdity of having a 2-year-old sitting unattended next to strangers on an airplane. This is a common-sense reform that grants the airlines flexibility while providing greater transparency and predictability for the flying public. Thank you.
I rise in opposition to this amendment. So let me understand. What I would say first and foremost is personal responsibility is to plan out in advance when you're going to travel. That's the best way to make sure you're sitting next to your children. And I used to have 2 small children, and we had to go through this. But under this amendment, you might understand that the priority is going to be seating families together, so that if a member of Congress, and I assume most of you travel by yourselves, they could bump you off the plane and put, since you wanted the families to sit together, that would be the unintended consequences of this? Sure.
Well, first of all, the airline can bump you off the plane today, but this doesn't say that. All this says is the carrier, the airline, must establish a policy to ensure to the extent practicable that you can sit together. To the extent practicable, the airline defines what that is. All it says is they've got to establish a policy and publish that policy.
Well, reclaiming our time, gentlemen, I think I oppose the amendment. We have a bipartisan agreement, compromise reflecting the hard work on both sides already in Section 501. The language contained in the bill is more than sufficient to address related families not knowing whether they're going to be able to sit together. At the time of booking, the airline has to say, we're not going to be able to seat you together. And again, that puts the responsibility back on the family. The unintended consequences of this would be, to me, there are going to be people bumped off of planes because the family waited to the last minute and didn't have their children sitting next to them. So again, I oppose this.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I would just point out that the airline's policy could very well say that in the situation you just posited where the family waits to the last minute and the only way is to bump a person off the plane, that that the family doesn't get to sit together. This doesn't require that they sit together. It simply requires that the airline have a policy, a stated policy that is published as to how to handle the situation.
Yeah, again, I oppose the amendment. I think this bipartisan agreement we have gets to the issue here, and with that, I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Davis.
If I may, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Nadler, for co-sponsoring this legislation, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including the provision that you just talked about, the bipartisan agreement on ensuring that families at the time of booking can work with the airlines to do what they can to ensure that they're seated together. And I do believe that is a great step in allowing families to know before they purchase those registered seats or reserved seats whether or not they might be able to have their child 12 and under sit next to them. I know the airlines are doing everything they can to try and seat families together now. Sometimes it's more difficult because there's not as much notification. And I rise in support of this amendment because, Mr. Nadler, it's in our bill we introduced together. I do want to say I do appreciate the bipartisan agreement, though, on the provision that's in there, because I think it will go very far in addressing many of the issues that you and I are both concerned about as parents and also as people who fly frequently. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Extremely grateful.
I have a question
thank you,
for the
Mr.
gentleman, if I may. Would you yield for a question?
Yes.
I wonder if what's in the manager's amendment means that there's notice at the time that the family books that they may or may not be seated together, but that we, in fact, I don't exactly know what's in the manager's amendment. Could you clarify?
It's underlying bill.
It is in the bill that they will
It's in
be.
the underlying bill. They will, at the time of you booking your seats, the airline will be able to look and say, we can't put you together, we don't have two seats together, so the family knows. Or we can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Which, if the gentleman will yield,
Gentleman
which
spoke
was,
the rules of time.
which was the base language in our bill that Mr. Nadler and I introduced earlier this year.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I agree with the gentleman that the inclusion of one of the two provisions in our joint bill in the underlying bill is a step forward, but the reason I support the amendment, or I've introduced the amendment, is I think it's not enough of a step forward because under the base bill, without the amendment, you go to original booking, the airline says, we can't seat the kids together. We can't seat you together with your kid. You have no option. The airline has no obligation, and there may not be another flight to the same, and it may be that other flights tell you the same thing. Under this bill, you may still not get satisfied, but at least it under this amendment, rather, at least it establishes an obligation on the part of the airline to have a policy to try to accommodate you to the extent practicable. That's all the amendment does. It doesn't guarantee you, but it goes a step further and says they have to have a policy to show how they'll try.
Reclaiming my time, I think the gentleman missed my comment that I'm going to support this.
I heard that, and I appreciate that.
But I do appreciate the work that the chairman's done. I do appreciate the work that the airlines have done. We're all witnesses. We've all been moved. We've moved voluntarily because the airlines are doing everything they can to seat kids together. I appreciate your amendment. I'm going to support it, but I really appreciate the underlying language in the bill, too, because I think it will go very far, and I yield back.
And just so all members understand, this amendment doesn't ask the airlines to do it. It says, no later than 80 days after the date of enactment of this act, the Secretary of Transportation shall issue regulations directing each air carrier to establish blah, blah.
To establish a policy.
Correct. But it's not the airlines doing it. It's the Secretary of Transportation.
No, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Cohen's recognized.
Hey, Mr. Nadler, let me ask you a question. The chairman said if this passes, a member of Congress could get bumped from a flight. If this doesn't pass, couldn't a member of Congress have to sit next to a 2-year-old?
Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing any amendments to the amendment? The question is on Mr. Nadler's amendment number 50. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. The noes have it. The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I ask for a roll call vote.